First and foremost, welcome to Rainbow Leadership, Lessons from LGBT Leaders. I am so excited to have all of you here today. And Eric is a graduate student at Ball State University in his final semester home stretch, where he studies statistics and social psychology. I think Eric and I are complete opposites. Stats are not my thing. At Ball State, he teaches core curriculum math courses and participates in research on the topics of prejudice and discrimination. Eric also loves doing research in the field of leadership, specifically LGBT leadership. Before starting grad school, Eric worked at Luxottica as a business analyst, where he primarily conducted workload forecasting and labor optimization analysis, but is now looking to continue his education into a PhD program in economics. So I know that I learn best from people who are not like me. And Eric, all of your experience in stats and mathematics, oh my goodness, not my wheelhouse. I'm so excited to be here with you and everyone else. Please make sure you stay on mute, rename yourself as you feel appropriate for this session, join us on camera if you can, and use the chat if you have any questions. So Eric, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jess. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone's doing great this afternoon or morning, depending on what time zone you are in. I am going to share my presentation with y'all and make sure I can see everybody. There we go. So I want this session to be a way that we can kind of all see and work together to figure out how we can utilize the identities that we hold, whether or not it's an identity that we necessarily can conceal or we cannot conceal, but I'll mostly be focusing on the identities that we all hold that perhaps other people can't innately tell that we hold, and how we can use these identities to, instead of I perhaps get stigmatized by them, get discriminated against by other people, we can actually leverage them to be better leaders and have better leadership outcomes. So for a little bit of information, I'm gay. In undergrad, I came out and kind of started going through the process of figuring out like what that means for me. And part of that for me was I want to do research. I want to do research about LGBT issues, particularly LGBT leadership issues, and see what we can learn and what kinds of, I suppose, generalizations can be made about this leadership styles that we see the LGBT community engaging in. And it's worth noting that similar to the way in which we can talk about leadership of like collectivist cultures and individualistic cultures, this is not to say that like this is lessons from LGBT leaders, not that all LGBT leaders will act like this, or this is how everybody engages in leadership. Rather, just something for people to consider. And I want to start by defining leadership. But I want to start by having other people define leadership. I have a diagram on the board, which is the way that I've been indoctrinated into thinking of leadership. But I want someone else to give me like, what is their single phrase, their one-liner for their definition of leadership? You can just unmute yourself and shout it out. That's great. Anybody?
Serving.
Serving. So you want to serve people as a leader.
Bringing out the best in people.
Bringing out the best in people.
Inspiring.
Inspiring. Sally?
Listening.
Listening.
And reacting.
And reacting.
Emulating. And setting the vision.
And setting the vision. I really like setting a vision.
Mentoring.
Mentoring.
Those are all really great. I can't even add something to that.
I can add something to it. So the idea of leadership, I mean, everyone holds different, I guess, like individualistic definitions of what leadership is. But leadership as perhaps a construct, while it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's individualistic view of leadership is not important. We can look at it from a more like systematic view and take this kind of component model to leadership where there's always some set of leaders, some set of followers, and they're working together towards some kind of goal. And in this case, specifically, leadership is a process by which leaders and followers develop some kind of relationship and work together towards a goal or goals within an environmental context shaped by cultural norms and values. And the reason why it's important to consider environmental context and values is, especially for this presentation, this idea of having these stigmatized identities. Different identities are stigmatized in different ways in different places. So the way in which perhaps a gay identity is stigmatized in the United States is going to be different than the way it is stigmatized in, say, Canada, which Canada, if you are unaware, is considered, based on survey data, the safest place for LGBT people to live. It's considered the most open country in the world in terms of LGBT rights. And so surely an LGBT leader there is going to experience different challenges than an LGBT leader in the United States. Now, what I'm going to do, this is an activity, and I'm going to break people up into breakout rooms to kind of discuss what they feel comfortable identifying. But I want people to consider this idea of a cultural iceberg, this idea that the tip is what's visible, but really what's visible about ourselves is going to be probably the least about us, right? We have these things that people can just look at us and tell. But then as we progress down this iceberg, it gets deeper and deeper into the water and you see less and less of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break people up into breakout rooms. And I want you to kind of just discuss with the people in your breakout rooms what you see as maybe some visible identities for yourself, some things that are maybe less visible about yourself, and things that you would consider not visible. And now I do want to just emphasize, don't feel like you need to share something that you otherwise would be uncomfortable about sharing. This is all about learning. And so if it's something that would make you uncomfortable, please feel like you don't feel pressured to share something outside of your comfort zone. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you all had some great discussions. I know I heard some great discussions as I was hopping between rooms. Does anybody would like to quickly kind of share perhaps what do we think fits into kind of like this top part of this iceberg? What kind of like components of ourselves?
How the world views us.
How the world views us, okay. What kind of things would lump into how the world views us? What kind of like demographics or characteristics?
Race.
Race?
Yeah, anything people can see. Yeah, so, you know, skin color and, you know, height and able-bodied versus non-able-bodied.
Gender.
This right here, if I do this on my screen, watch, and all you hear is my voice, the immediate thing that you try to understand is that sounds like a male voice over there. Old Marine Corps command voice, probably. But this is who I am. But that's what I deal with every day. But I do it deliberately too, though. I love the challenge.
So that's absolutely right. Everything at the top, including age, like the clothes you're wearing, the language that you speak, they all contribute to the way in which people can visually see you. But underneath the iceberg, there's so much more, right? There's the patterns of speech. So, right, a lot of times people use perhaps certain indicators of speech to indicate sexual orientation. They use other kinds of perhaps less visible, but things that people can still notice, right? Favorite foods. What kind of places are you going to go eat at? That necessarily isn't something that people are going to just know by looking at you, but it is something that if they spend enough time with you, they'll be able to kind of pick up. But then there's also the things that no matter how much time someone spends with you, oftentimes they will not be able to know about this particular identity unless you explicitly tell them. They can make assumptions, but they can't necessarily know. So for example, a lot of times people they'll be like, oh, well, I thought you were gay. Or you come out to someone, they're like, oh, I knew you were gay. No, you didn't know. Nobody knows. You can guess, you can make an assumption. No one really knows your personal belief on a particular issue, right? So like, I could tell you a list of my personal opinions about political topics, but you can make assumptions. Perhaps like I've said one type of opinion before, and you can make kind of an extrapolation out, but you don't know. And so this presentation is how we can take these things at the bottom, things that just are absolutely not visible, things that people might be able to guess about you, but they can't know about you, and disclose these in situations where you feel like you have the power and the benefits with minimal costs to disclose them, where you feel safe, but you also have the ability to make a meaningful impact. And I'm going to start by kind of defining stigma a little bit. There's a bunch of different ways that we can define stigma, but the first is kind of a very old, archaic way of thinking about stigma. There's these 3 different types of stigma that exist. Tribal stigma, that is basically about these groups that we can form theoretically, about like ethnicity, race, and religion, things that are more face value. They're more things that there's like a cultural aspect to them. And then there's physical disabilities, deafness, blindness, any kind of non-able-bodiedness fits into this second category. And the last one is what the author, it's Goffman, was the original person that kind of introduced stigma, says blemishes of character, which include addiction, mental health, and perhaps like a gay identity. And these continue to be true in the way that we think about it. But originally, stigma was defined as any attribute about a person that can be deeply discrediting, meaning that the inherent idea behind stigma is that when you hold a stigmatized identity, you are discredited. As a person, as a leader, there is a negative, problematic target on your back, right? However, in a more perhaps fluid idea of stigma and what it is, it's really about our ability to label differences between people, stereotype our outgroup, separate ourselves from them, and then discriminate against them. It's a way for us to maintain our power and make other people feel bad, basically, right? It's a way to instill division in society. That is where stigma comes from. It's an us versus them mentality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that stigma always is going to, that we have to let stigma and the way that people stigmatize us keep us in a corner and keep us down. And this research by she basically developed this idea of empowerment through stigma as opposed to finding coping mechanisms for stigma. And they talk about positive stigma in the sense that there are processes that successfully, that stigmatized individuals can use to overcome the harmful consequences associated with stigma. One, compensation, where they develop some kind of skill that compensates for the stigma. So in the case of LGBT people, it may be a particular development of like being very good at school, right? So you're a child, you're not out, you're in elementary school, you try to perform as well as possible, because if you can be known as the smart kid, you're not going to ever be known as the gay kid. And in the case of maybe mental health, say you're depressed, you fall into some kind of skill category that will lead people away from identifying your depression perhaps, and then instead will identify you with this other skill that you've developed. The other one is strategic interpretation of our social environment. And the idea is if we can reconceptualize the way that the world is around us to make sure that we fit into it in a meaningful way, we can reduce the stigma that impacts us. And it's a matter now of, as being leaders, we can then take this reimagination, or not even just reimagination, but perhaps a more positive view of our world and share it with our followers. And the last one is the ability to draw upon multiple identities. This idea that I am not just gay, I am also a graduate student. I am also a researcher. I am a statistician. I hold a very strong sense of anxiety in my life. These kinds of things. Like I'm multitudes, right? This idea that I'm also an ODK member. You can draw upon the communities that give you strength to kind of take away from the perhaps negative associations that certain people are applying to you at any given point in time. It's about empowerment, not about coping. So let's quickly talk about the ways people come out. And this research is really drawn from the LGBT community, but it can be applied to any concealable identity, meaning anything that someone's not going to be able to see about you unless you tell them. There's the intrapersonal perspective, this idea that you need to, for yourself, accept that this is a part of who you are before you can really go out and tell other people. You got to really internalize what it means. And so in the case of LGBT people, it's this idea that internalized, we have this idea of heteronormativity, this idea that there are certain assumptions about sexual orientation and gender that society pushes upon us and imposes on us that we are supposed to fit into, and realizing that perhaps you don't need to fit into that is your interpersonal ability to come out, or your intrapersonal, where your interpersonal is kind of coming out through stories, right? When you start talking to other people and you start expressing to other people what it means to like be who you are. Sorry. And then the last one is a way that we can kind of model these interpersonal and intrapersonal developments, which are models. And the general idea that I just kind of wanted to get across from this model is that really we all start in kind of a closeted phase and an out phase, where being out, in the case of, we can take me, for example. Let me walk you through my coming out story. When I was like in elementary school, I was starting to figure out that I was perhaps different than other people. And I started like comparing myself to others and trying to figure out exactly what was it. I'm smaller than people. I'm very small. I'm 5'6". You can't tell because I'm sitting down, but I assure you I'm very small. But that wasn't it. That wasn't why I felt different. I wasn't good at sports. That wasn't it. I liked music. Still not it. Couldn't really figure it out until about high school, when people started being like, oh, I really like that girl. And I was like, I really don't like that girl. I really have no interest in her at all. The only queens in my life are Lady Gaga and Britney Spears. Everyone else is just null to me. And then you start to finally identify. And this happened in college for me. I finally was like, oh. And for me personally, I went from this, oh, I'm gay, to, okay, I'm gay. There's nothing I can really do about it. Like as soon as I kind of acknowledged it, I kind of skipped this tolerance phase, where most of the time it's when people kind of start slightly engaging in this concealable identity, but reluctantly. They're doing it out of need as opposed to out of desire or like out of acceptance. Where then this identity acceptance phase is when you kind of finally just say, this is who I am, to somebody else. And then you become proud of that identity, perhaps even to the point that you are suppressing other parts of yourself to really embrace this identity, right? So when I first came out, my friend described me as militantly gay. That was the phrase he used to describe me. And it wasn't until I kind of started to figure out exactly how this part of my identity fit into the rest of who I am that it allowed me to kind of synthesize down to just becoming a part of me. And I wanted to kind of describe this as I just shared this pretty intimate story with you about who I am. And it helped you to relate to me, right? It helped you to relate to me as a leader. This is one way that we can use our stigmatized identities to relate to other people. We can become vulnerable, and being vulnerable allows other people to feel as though they can open up to us. And so to allow ourselves to be vulnerable means to allow other people to be vulnerable and actually form this relationship between leaders and followers that is necessary for us to come towards some kind of common goal. So what can we actually learn, maybe perhaps existentially, from LGBT leaders? The first is, what really is an LGBT reality? And this comes from some research that kind of tried to summarize a bunch of individual qualitative stories. So a bunch of people sat in a room, interviewed people, asked them about their experiences being a part of the LGBT community. And they boiled it down into 3 overall kinds of experiences. One is biculturalism, this idea that the person feels as though they're simultaneously existing between 2 cultures. And this doesn't just happen for LGBT people, but they are existing between their gay culture and their straight culture, right? They have to be fully aware of what straight people are doing in order to operate in society, but then they also have this entire subculture that exists for them to try and be themselves and be gay. Now, to be fair, there are many, many flaws with the gay community and the way in which we ostracize people, and we are racist as white gays. We are fat phobic as a whole group. If you were to summarize things, there are problems, right? But there exists too, and you're existing simultaneously at the same time. The second one is marginality, and it's this idea that because people are going to perhaps stigmatize you and treat you differently for being gay, you've experienced this idea as being treated as insignificant, perhaps. So many LGBT people have this experience where they get marginalized, where they get forced into being this insignificant group. And in a lot of times, they then take that from perhaps this straight culture where they're marginalized in. They then, when they're more comfortable in their gay culture, they then marginalize other groups within that culture to perhaps feel more empowered, which isn't good. Let me be very clear. That's very problematic. And the last one is normative creativity, which is the ability to think about problems abstractly. And it comes from this idea that there isn't one right way to be gay. There isn't one right way to be really any identity. And being forced into this idea that you come out and you think to yourself, well, now what? What does it mean for me to hold this identity? What does it mean for me to be gay? What does it mean for me to have anxiety? Like, what do these things mean? And a lot of times I'll be using gay as an example, but it really, truly, all of these concepts apply liberally to any other concealable identity that you might hold, whether it be mental health, addiction status, anything, HIV status, any kind of perhaps health, like autoimmune disorder, anything like that. And once we've kind of established these 3 things, there's also this idea of G quotient leadership. And it's basically because of this LGBT reality, gay leaders tend to operate in a way through this inclusion, creativity, communication, intuition, collaboration, what I've listed on the screen. They use these kinds of skills, or this kind of like rubric, perhaps, to make sure that their followers feel included. And it's more broadly characterized as it creates a more pleasant work environment, stresses the respect of others, and gives employees agency over their successes and failures, because it was developed in a business context, and so they use a lot of business terms. But the general idea is that you're trying to show your followers that you care about them and giving them the agency over themselves to succeed. And it's worth noting that this idea works in both a homogenous group and a heterogeneous group. And what I mean by that is, so let's take the Human Rights Campaign, for example. The Human Rights Campaign is led by LGBTQ people for LGBTQ equality. It's a homogenous group, right? Whereas Apple is led by a gay man, Tim Cook, but is filled with many employees many of them are not gay, right? But these ideas still apply. However, the way in which we think about applying them needs to slightly be changed in order for people not to perhaps revolt. I guess I can't think of a better word, to show disdain. In the first, sharing your story is much safer. But in the second, in a heterogeneous group, it's much more dangerous. There's much more cost associated with perhaps being stigmatized and discriminated against for holding your identity. And so you have to be conscious of the people in the context, both in place and time, in location, the culture of that group. So for example, if the heterogeneous group is just straight and gay, but everyone kind of holds the same religion or lack of religion, it's different than if we're talking about me as a single gay individual within a group of a bunch of very conservative people and perhaps not open. These are different contexts, and we need to be conscious when we want to disclose different pieces about ourselves to these different groups, right? But how does coming out really, what's the framework? In my mind, like, I can tell you all these things, but there is existing literature in authentic leadership, this idea that we can be ourselves and that makes us better leaders, that coming out facilitates. It doesn't guarantee it. Saying that I'm gay right here in front of you does not make me an authentic leader, because there are things about authentic leadership and authentic leaders that just saying I'm gay does not accomplish. But coming out does. This whole process that I went through earlier, this idea that you kind of start really confused and then you start to figure out more and more about what it is about yourself. You've learned lessons from that. You personally have learned lessons about yourself that you can now use to inform your leadership. All of these lessons, all these these feelings that you don't want to replicate, right? You felt pushed down, you felt ignored. You don't have to push those feelings onto other people. You know what they feel like. You now know that you have the ability as a leader, once you get into a position, to avoid applying those kinds of feelings to other people. Similarly, relational transparency, me saying I'm gay is about as relationally transparent as I could possibly be about my sexual orientation. Now, that doesn't mean relational transparency doesn't mean telling everybody everything, right? I'm not going to stand up here and tell you intimate details about my sex life, but I am going to tell you about my sexual orientation, and that helps you perhaps bond with me. So there is an extent for relational transparency, but the idea is that you are willing to share yourself with other people. Now, and I like to say this specifically like this because it's just the things about coming out, no matter what identity you're coming out with, is it does not guarantee that you're a good person, right? Internalized moral perspective. Me being gay does not mean that I can't shoot someone on the street. Like, just quite frankly, it just does not mean that. There's nothing about my identity that inherently instills morality or lack of morality in me, right? So this is not me saying that being gay, having anxiety, being addicted to a substance, that your morality is not tied to any of these things. And a lot of times society might claim that it is tied to these things. It isn't. Just quite frankly, I fail to accept it. And if we live in a world that our identities that we perhaps don't choose ever, definitely don't choose in many circumstances, have some kind of implication on our greater morality, seems foolish to me. So let's continue. And then balanced processing it basically is objectivity, right? You can also be highly subjective and not want to focus on facts as someone who is willing to share their identity with other people. But this idea of coming out does help facilitate these two components of authentic leadership and help you perhaps gain some of these benefits of authentic leadership that can very much, at the end of the day, help you be a better leader by allowing your followers to feel like they know who you are, they can trust you, and then work well for you or with you, depending on how you want to think about leadership. So let's use Pete Buttigieg as an example, one of my all-time favorite, recent favorites in terms of leadership and using him as a case study. If you don't know who Pete Buttigieg is, he recently ran for president. And he's the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, which is great because I live in Indiana right now. I don't live in South Bend. I live in Muncie, but it is kind of close, a couple hours away. And he came out as gay before his second election to mayor in 2015. And he came out as gay and then got reelected. And in Indiana, that's a pretty big accomplishment. Like, even though South Bend is a fairly liberal city in Indiana, saying you're liberal in Indiana is still not saying a lot all the time. And so for him to get reelected was very, very interesting. but there are some things that we need to talk about, right? And these aren't faults. This is just the reality that we live in. Pete does not, he passes us straight. And what I mean by that is you look at Pete Buttigieg and you don't immediately think to yourself, oh, I'm going to assume he's gay. And the lack of assumption means that he has a particularly powerful ability to conceal his identity when he needs to and expose it when he wants to, and he knows that it is going to benefit him. And one example is he had an interview on Fox News, and I think he was just sitting there. It hadn't come up. His sexual orientation hadn't come up, because why would it come up? Because they're talking about like economics. Who would care, right? Who cares about your sexual orientation if you're talking about trade? But the Fox anchor asked him, well, like a lot of our constituents are concerned about your family values. And so that's when he had the opportunity to say, well, let's talk about family values if you want to talk about family values. Like, yes, I am a gay man that has been married to one husband, and we have a single home in South Bend, Indiana with our 2 dogs. Donald Trump, as Donald Trump was obviously his opponent, he's sleeping with porn stars. He's been married 3 times. He said all these publicly horrible things. So if we're going to talk about family values, what are you talking about? There's no problem here, right? Like, I am living, other than the fact that I've married a man, in exactly like nuclear family kind of family values that otherwise, if Chasten was a woman, would have been perfect and everyone would have loved. And this ability for him to kind of point out the flaws, but also not engage in many of the costs associated with being gay, because he kind of, a lot of these negative costs about being, perhaps in psychology we say non-prototypical male, would mean that when we think of masculinity, we first think of a list of things, right? Or when we think of femininity, we list of a couple things. And Pete fits that list of masculine things. He doesn't fall into this non-prototypical category that a lot of people assume gay men fall into. So he doesn't have these costs necessarily of disclosing his sexual orientation in the same way. And so he gets the blessing of maximizing the benefits while minimizing the costs. And even in the certain circles of highly conservative individuals who don't want to perhaps see him be president because of his sexual orientation, the best that they can come up with of insulting him is they call him Pete Buttplug. That is the extent. That is the extent that they can come up with, because he's done such a great job of navigating and applying his identity as a leader in a way that's going to minimize these stigmas, whether it be through these, like, we can't attack him, right, for being not capable, right? We know he's developed these sets of skills that are compensating for perhaps having a stigmatized identity. And he's showing us a world where we are, he's reframing the way that we think about family values and showing us the flaws and perhaps the heteronormative view of family values as this strategic interpretation of the social environment, right? And then he shares this strategic interpretation with other people with the idea of changing their mind. So let's broadly, at the end here, talk about what this boils down to for you and I, like you and I as leaders. We have benefits and we have indicators of risk. And I say indicators of risk because you can guess what's going to happen and you can always be surprised. I unfortunately had to come out to one of my mentors, who is a 68-year-old Indiana native white male who I was certain was not going to be very accepting of the fact that I needed to come out to him to tell him this. Basically, a student hit on me. It was a nightmare. I don't want to talk about it. And I told him, and he was just like, oh, yeah, it's fine. He's like, oh, I completely understand. Like, my niece identifies as trans non-binary. And so I like don't need to worry about me perhaps like discriminating against you. And just like his nonchalant kind of just like, oh yeah, like don't worry about it. I can tell you're stressed, but like don't worry about being stressed about this particular thing was like an incredibly just, I should have given him the benefit of the doubt. I didn't, because I wanted to minimize potential costs. So I tried to think about like, what are all the ways that this could go horribly, horribly wrong for me? And I wouldn't say that in this particular instance, I was in a position of leadership. I would say that between the two of us, I was more of a follower trying to get some advice and help. But the idea stands for leaders. We have to think about our followers' demographics. We have to think about how our followers might respond to us. And we have to kind of guess. And there is certain correlations between other minority statuses of like membership in other minority groups outside of perhaps the stigmatized identity that you are trying to reveal, that will positively reflect or like will have a positive like support for you. But it's also important to note that environment and culture, big impact. I will not be coming out publicly in the Middle East anytime soon. It is trending in a very positive direction, but I personally will not probably even visit those regions out of just there is too high of a probability of risk. That being said, there is a lot of benefits. And there's also some risk that I haven't necessarily talked about too much, but it's kind of lumped into this benefit, and it's called efficiency. And what I mean by efficiency is that stigma actually leads to depletion. And what I mean by depletion is if I'm trying to describe to you my relationship status and I say I have a partner instead of I have a boyfriend, but I know that I'm actively choosing to call my boyfriend my partner there, and I'm thinking about it because I'm actively trying to avoid using the term boyfriend to indicate my sexual orientation, I actually am going to have what's known as cognitive depletion. And cognitive depletion ultimately results in poor memory, poor test performance, and poor physical endurance. So you will run slower and for a shorter distance if right before you choose to run, you have a conversation with someone and you try to avoid outing yourself. You will actually perform worse on physical tasks, not just mental tasks, but physical tasks. And so coming out and not worrying and not needing to worry and not be cognizant of potential risk does in fact make you more efficient and more productive as a leader and as a person. Additionally, you have this increased potential access to these authentic leadership outcomes when you are willing to share yourself. And last, you get to be inspirational. You get to be this person. You get to kind of bear some of the costs of your followers. So me as a gay leader, getting to come out publicly as gay means that my followers, they know that they can come out to me as gay without having to feel the same kind of cost, but I will experience a lot of cost on their behalf. So me being very public about something means that I get to eat the costs of some of the coming out process for my followers. And that's, in my mind, the greatest idea, is that as a leader, we have to make that decision. Are we going to basically eat these costs, take in these costs for our followers so we know that they can succeed and be themselves? I'm going to try my best throughout my life to be that person that will be public and be open about things so other people can feel comfortable telling me their lives, even if that means that I'm going to experience more hate throughout my life. This is going to be basically the end. And it is worth noting that risks, benefits, everything's moderated by your personality. If you're a very extroverted person, you're probably going to be able to facilitate decreased costs. And what I mean by that is you aren't necessarily going to be forced into the same kind of losing family, losing the ability to access certain businesses. Because if you're this very extroverted, bubbly personality, you can kind of, for lack of a better word, persuade people in a different way. Same with benefits, right? Introversion, being an out introverted leader is going to be different than an out extroverted leader. I'm going to chase away a lot of people by being extroverted. But that's not to say that a lot of people aren't going to necessarily feel uncomfortable with me, but they will feel as though maybe they can't share with me because I am too loud and they think that I am too big and too flashy. We have options. we need introverted leaders also. We need people that have different personalities to all step forward together, because ultimately, even though you just have to be more cognizant of how your individual personality, the way in which you experience other people, can be used to benefit yourself and for your followers. Now, I want to give everyone the opportunity to answer some questions. We have about 10 minutes left in our session. So I want to open it up for questions. I also have a list of references. If anyone wants to read some of the actual literature that I have read, I can send you this list as well. I can send you a whole bunch of stuff. I have a whole thesis on authentic LGBT leadership. If you are interested, it is very theoretical though, but you are more than welcome to access it if you are interested. Does anybody have any questions?
Eric, we do have a few comments here in the chat that we can bring up. Corinne did mention that Pete has a book and she highly suggests it. He's a fascinating person. Cassandra had a really important point that says we tend to internalize minority stress and amplify it back out. And just to say, be real if you can safely do so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for all your comments. The general, I think, idea that I want to get across is that, you know, in today's society, there's a big, strong push for you to be your authentic self. But your authentic self, being your authentic self doesn't have to mean putting yourself at unnecessary risk if you feel as though you don't have the ability. But so for example, like when I was in college, I had to I set up an entire system of if my parents kicked me out of the house, where would I live during the summer? And I set up an entire network of this is where I would go. This is the job that I would get before I ever told them anything. And I set up all the systems so that way I could come out. But you shouldn't feel the need to if that's something that is going to put too much cost on you. But as a leader, if you do, you should be aware that you taking some costs, you will be able to take away some of the costs of your followers.
That's a good point, Eric, if you don't mind me saying so. It's from my own personal experience, you talked about coming out and discussing those things earlier. My route was a little bit different from yours, but the whole story and the whole process emboldens others to come out if they wish and if they can. For instance, I came out in 2015, but that was immediately after an attempt at suicide. I had to go see a psychologist as a result, and the VA takes great care of me now. But I was also a business owner at the time with 3 restaurants in the middle of Missouri. So when I came out, it made front page news. Local restaurateur transitioning. So I'm in the whole half of the front page of the local newspaper had my picture on it and my businesses on it. And as traumatizing as that could be for some people, that was actually emboldening for me and for others in the community who had children who were trans, because they came to my restaurants and they said, I am so glad that you're out. I'm so glad that you did this so boldly and so openly, because now I know that my child will be safe. I know that they can be safe and be real. And that's what gave me strength to be so vocally out now, where you cannot escape me in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. You can't, there's no way. I'm everywhere. I talk everywhere. I talk at the University of Alabama, out at the Veterans Administration. I am active in everything, pushing. As a matter of fact, I pushed the campus to have a Transgender Day of Visibility on March 31st, which was massive here in the South. So anyway, those things give people reason to follow. Because they see that it can be done and it can be done for real. But for me, the safest place, as I mentioned in the little room earlier, is in the middle of the street. I stand out so boldly, so strongly, and so vividly for everyone who is like me. But I do it for another reason too, though, because one of the most marginalized groups, Eric, within our community is Black transgender women. they experience more violence, more threats against their lives. Now, I've had people tell me to kill myself, cousins, when I came out, but nothing like what they experience. And I am out for them because I want them to know that I can and will take the brunt of anything that comes my way for them on their behalf. And they know that authenticity, and that's what a leader is to me, being real, being vulnerable, as you mentioned, in so many ways. And you're so right, that being out there, being open, what you've talked about is real. Eric, you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
So I don't know if it's really a question more so than like a statement, but I guess I never realized, you know, the sort of us and them stigma. Of course, like I've known about it, and I played into the stigma because I myself, I'm gay as well, but I'm unfortunately not completely out to my family. And it's, you know, like you're often isolated. Like a lot of people don't like to talk about it, but what makes like this community a little bit different is that, you know, we come home and we're different. Like we don't have people to relate to. So oftentimes we have to like very dangerously so branch out to people online. And, you know, that can lead to unsafe altercations if you're not careful about it. So I'm losing my train of thought, but so anyway, thank you for the presentation. I don't know where I'm going with it, so I'm going to stop, but thank you for it.
No, thank you, Brandon. I completely agree. I think for the longest time, like when you have to think about it and you're like at home and you're like, okay, well, like if I'm with my friends, I know I can act this way, but then being at home, I know I can't. Well, things are different for me now, thankfully, but like for a long time, it was like, well, I can't say this, I can't do this. I don't want to act like this because what if like every single time someone's like, oh, hey, can we talk with you real quick? It's like a drop in your stomach. At least it was for me. Like every single time someone's like, hey, we need to talk real quick, I'd just be like, oh, they know. Oh, they know. And yeah, thank you for sharing.
So Brandon, man, we've got you. We're surrounding you right now. We are standing there with you, man. You've got support. Believe me. I can tell you some of my story, by the way, Eric. Family stuff. Okay, so when I came out in 2015, it was a matter of life or death. So I sent a letter to all of my children. I have 4. To all of my employees. I had 30 at the time, I think. To all my siblings and my mother. Had once. and the whole idea was to get this done with because I could not live otherwise. So my mother came running out, brought the family out to Missouri, and she goes, "Is this just a fad?" Anyway, guys, you'll do fine. You've got it. I mean, you've got this.
And I think these are great.
Can I add one last piece? Do you have time for one last comment?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I just like to share, I think the most important thing out of all of this is first and foremost, understand that you're a person and a person worthy of respect. And you have to have that confidence and be self-empowered. Now, of course, I'll speak personally because I am a Black lesbian woman. And I came out over 40 years ago. Different time, different attitudes. My greatest concern was making certain that I did not get hurt or harmed. Cassandra, you talked about Black trans women being the most vulnerable. You're absolutely right, but I can also tell you Black women, even at that time, and there was, you know, you had to live a different kind of way, and you had different language, and even the circles that you traveled in. But You know, but to this day, I could care less what you would think about my orientation. What I'm concerned about is what I bring to the table as an empowered, smart individual who's capable and confident of leading. That's what the most important piece is. You know, sure, that's a part of who we are. And when you are comfortable with that, and you and that I believe that's a process, you know, because you have all these things that are going on around you, and you're living this way here with these folks, and then you live another way with these folks. We're some of the most resilient people because of those kinds of challenges and environmental factors that we have had to deal with through the years. So what I can say to you, Brandon, is it's going to be all right, but you've got to come to terms with you and be all right with who you are. And when you're there with that, hey, listen, because it doesn't stop you from being the son to the mother who bored you, who loves you. You know, she's got to deal with her own issues. If that's what the case is, she's got to deal with it and come into the light. Because I can tell you, when I did come out to my people over 40 some odd years ago, I'm 65, okay? It wasn't easy, but I was coming into who I am and how I wanted to live and feel good about myself. And so you can't keep hiding. You can't keep running away from yourself. But it's a process, and when you come to terms with that, and you living in that moment, you're going to be all right. So, you know, I'm appreciative that there's been such a different kind of a change in the attitude in 2021. Now, yes, there's still a lot of work to be done, but there's a much different climate than it was when I came out, and some of the many challenges that I lived through. But I'm here to tell you, I'm all right, you know, and that's what I project first and foremost, that by which that I am all right, and I'm capable and competent and confident in leading whatever that charge is. And that's what's most important.
Marcia, I'm going to just say, I love you. You are awesome. Oh, wow. That is
Thank you
so
for sharing.
Thank you. And you talked about resilience and things in there. There are studies that show we are resilient. And as we get older, we become more so. It's because of all those things that we've experienced to get here. You know, everything that made us who we are, we are resilient because of it. You've got strength you don't know you have. And you've got strength that'll come out as you get older and as you mature into this thing of who you are with your identity and your leadership and your scholarship. All those things, you've got this. And I'm just so appreciative of Marcia's story. And oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for sharing your stories and talking about yourself openly. I really appreciate that so much. And just to quickly answer one question in the chat from Montana, where they asked, as a cis white woman, I would love to hear if you have any tips for leaders to be allies to empower the LGBT community without overstepping boundaries. And I think ultimately it's just to listen and ask questions. And as long as you're listening, I think that you're going to be a great ally. And thank everybody. I do have to end the session. We do need to head to the next set of concurrent sessions. I really appreciate everybody for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you want to talk or anything, feel free to message me in the Event Mobi platform.